Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Chodesh Tov. The Torah reading that we're going to be looking at today is a challenging Torah reading to read. It deals, unless I would say you've devoted yourself to the medical arts, then it's actually really interesting as we look at how the ancient Israelites dealt with some disease and some illness. It's translated most often as leprosy, although tsara'at, which is what is being talked about here, probably isn't exactly what leprosy is, because this version of a disease not only affects people and our skin and things like that, but it actually affects our homes and items as well, and leprosy didn't do that. Maybe they were thinking about the fact that it's contagious and it can be passed along through contact, and that's a possibility. But the rabbis went in a different direction with this. The rabbis talked about this illness as being something that specifically comes from the sin of lashon hara, of speaking negative, of the evil tongue, of speaking negatively or evil about someone else. And we see this because of Moses and Miriam, where Miriam spoke negatively about Moses' wife Tzipporah, and she was afflicted with leprosy. We see this in a couple of other places as well. So the rabbis make a connection between this particular sin of speaking evil or negatively about a person and leprosy or tsara'at, whatever this disease was. Let's keep that in mind for a moment, because I'm going to ask a more general question, and then we're going to get back into talking about our parsha. What is the difference between guilt and shame? What is the difference between guilt and shame? If you had to answer that for somebody, how would you answer that? It's not a rhetorical question. I'm looking for answers. What's the difference? Yes. Okay, guilt is how you feel about yourself. Shame is how you think others may, or how you feel others may think about you. Good. What else? Guilt and shame. What's the difference? It's an important concept, and there are a number of different anthropologists who have done some studies about guilt cultures and shame cultures, because they're very different, right? So Ruth Benedict wrote a book about Japanese culture called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and she's the one who really popularized this idea of a difference between guilt cultures and shame cultures. And she said cultures like ancient Greece, Japan, they were shame cultures. Cultures like Judaism and those influenced by it, most notably Calvinism and some other Christian denominations, were guilt cultures. And the difference between them, she wrote, is very substantial. In shame cultures, what matters most is the judgment of others. Right? Acting morally, quote unquote, means you are conforming to what the general society has said is what is moral. Right? And if you think about it, Greece, ancient Greece especially, and Japan, the samurai culture, right? This is what the society said, and the expectation was for you to conform to that. And if not, you were shamed, you were ostracized, right? People in shame cultures, she argued, are other-directed. That's what you're saying, right? We're worried about what other people are going to think about us, and therefore we make our decisions based on that. However, people who are in guilt cultures think about this differently, right? People who are in guilt cultures are not thinking about what other people are worried about or what matters to other people, but we're thinking about the voice of our conscience. And if we do something wrong, right, it's our conscience internally that makes us feel that guilt. It's our conscience internally that says, no, this was wrong. And it may be that nobody else knows about it, right? In a shame culture, you only get that feedback if somebody else knows what you've done. But in a shame culture, if you've done something wrong and nobody knows about it, you're fine, no problem. But in a guilt culture, it's different. It doesn't matter if nobody else knows, because you know. And your conscience is going to be telling you that this was wrong and that this is a problem. And what's interesting is, for the most part, as I've said, Judaism is about guilt, right? We're really good at guilt. We and the Catholics, we do it really, right? But what's interesting is this parsha is one of the few places that we actually see the opposite. Because what happens, right? What happens is if you speak negatively about somebody, there is an external display of that through tsarat, through this disease, whether it's on your skin, whether it's in your home, that people can see. And then there is actually a step of ostracization. I think that's how I would say that, of ostracizing, right, of putting somebody outside the community until the tsarat, until this disease runs its course, and then they're brought back in. And it's an interesting moment, and the question is why? What is it about lashon hara, about speaking evil, speaking negatively about somebody, that would cause this switch for us in what is normally a guilt culture of, I know I've done something wrong, I have to do that, to an external faced moment? What would you say? Why might that be? We're not very participatory today. My goodness. Well, let's break down what is the sin and effect of lashon hara, right? Of the evil tongue. Speaking bad about somebody, right? Speaking bad about somebody. We can assume that that's not done privately, right? Because just to think something bad about somebody, that's different, right? Speaking bad about somebody is automatically including somebody else now in this. And one of the things as the rabbis talk about lashon hara, as the rabbis talk about the evil tongue, and by the way, it can even be true, right? Lashon hara can be true. It can be true that this person is X, Y, or Z, but we still shouldn't do it because it creates a negative image or a negative portrayal of that person that then what happens? It spreads, right? It spreads. It's actually one of the sins, like if I don't like Shabbat candles, if I don't keep kosher, right, other laws that are here, it really just affects only me and my relationship with God, maybe my family, right? If I'm going to say we're not going to keep kosher anymore, we're not going to keep Shabbat anymore, or whatever it is, right? Pick a law. But once we get into lashon hara, the evil tongue, it's insidious because it spreads and then you lose control over it. So I may go and I may tell Alan something, and I may think, well, that's all, it's just me and Alan that are going to know about it. But Alan may choose to tell Judy, right? And then Judy may choose to tell Andrew. And all of a sudden, it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. And to combat that, the Torah needed to make this shift, to say society itself needs to say, this is not okay. It's not enough just for our internal voice to say that's not okay, because, by the way, that's already failed. We've already spoken that. But society needs to say, no, this isn't okay. And there are certain things that when we look at, and Lashon Hara is the paradigmatic example of that, when we look at it, we say, wait a second. When I make this decision, it doesn't just affect me, it affects other people around me. And we have to think about that differently. We have to look at that differently. We have to create extra cautions and extra barriers so that we don't do something that is going to hurt other people as it goes forward. That is, to me, one of the really incredible lessons of this week's Parsha. As we get this shift in the Torah for how we normally deal with things. I'll end with one other piece of it. Just like the damage was done with somebody else, right? Just like the damage is done with somebody else, so too is the healing done with somebody else. It takes the Kohen and to interact, be with that person, to say, now this healing is taking place. It isn't done privately. It isn't done. We don't just say, okay, this person is out, and now we don't let them back in. We don't care. We don't look. We don't. No, the Kohen has to go on a regular basis and check to see if the tzara'at is gone. The Kohen then brings that person back in, and it's something that the rabbis understood sometimes, especially when we're in the middle of speaking negatively about somebody. It really does take somebody else to say, you know, you shouldn't really do that, because we don't know. We don't see it in ourselves a lot of times. Sometimes we do, but often we don't. And I want to end with an amazing section from the Talmud. It's actually from Masechet Brachot. And it goes as follows. Rabbi Yochanan's student, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, fell ill. And Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him and said, is your suffering dear to you? Right? Do you like this suffering? And he said to him, I welcome neither this suffering nor its reward. Right? Meaning, I could do without it. Thank you very much. Right? He said to him, give me your hand. And he gave him his hand, and he lifted him up, and he took him out from that illness. He restored him to health. Similarly, it says, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. And Rabbi Chanina entered to him and said, is your suffering dear to you? And Rabbi Yochanan said, I can do without it too. He said to him, give me your hand. And he gave him his hand, and he lifted him up. And the Gemara then asks the question, why did Rabbi Yochanan wait for Rabbi Chanina to restore him to health? If he was able to heal his student, why wasn't he able to heal himself? Right? It says, let Rabbi Yochanan stand himself up. The Gemara answers, a prisoner is not the one who can free himself from prison. There are certain things that when we are in that state of mind, we need somebody else to bring us out of it, to hold our hand, to walk us out, to make us realize that that's where we are. And so we have this powerful combination of a sin that affects other people, Lashon Hara, a response, at least in the Torah, that creates an awareness in the community, and a need for somebody else to go and to actually help that person out of that predicament. Reminds us, we're not in this just on our own and for ourselves. So this Rosh Chodesh, this Shabbat, as we read Tazria and Metzora, may we recognize the power and the gift that family, friends, and community has to lift us up and to take us out of whatever prisons in our minds and in our bodies we may be in, so that we can be free. Shabbat Shalom.